Hello everyone, this is the video for chapter 15, which is all about airplane performance. So before we delve into the real fun stuff, I just want to talk real quickly about performance in general. As a reminder, when we look at performance, we worry about things like the airplane's, the air that it's operating in, the air density. So we worry about things like density altitudes. Remember, we said density altitude is, pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. And you're like, well, what the heck does that mean? It's basically wind chill for your airplane. So as the density altitude goes up, the air gets thinner, your performance goes down. So what causes high density altitude? Think high, hot, and humid. So high elevations. If it's a hot temperature, those molecules are banging around more, so they have more distance between each other. So the density is less. And humid. If it's humid, that water displaces oxygen in the air. So that gives you a high density altitude. Now, if I look at a particular aircraft, I can say, all right, what is the performance going to be at a certain density altitude? So if I look at the manual, or in this case an AFM, this is for a Cessna 172S. So this aircraft has an AFM, Aircraft Flight Manual. Now remember, the difference is that this is tied to a specific serial number, whereas a POH, Pilot Operating Handbook, is not. And this will have standard sections, the general section, limitations, emergency procedures, normal procedures, performance, which is what we're going to talk about, weight and balance, that's for next week, airplane and system descriptions, and then we have section 8. It's got like how do you handle it, how do you service it, things like that. And then any supplements. If I get new equipment installed, it might require a supplement for my AFM or POH. So real quickly, if I look through the general section, it's going to tell me about this aircraft, what are its dimensions. The wings are 36 feet and an inch wide. How big's the prop? Maximum 76 inches in diameter. How long is the thing? How tall is it? What kind of an engine does it have? This is actually the 180 horsepower engine. So this is the 172S. How much fuel does it have? It has 53 gallons of usable fuel out of 56 total. What kind of oil does it use? What are its weights? Its maximum takeoff weight is 2550 in the normal category. Limits for baggage compartments. What's the maximum useful load? 895 pounds. And some other stuff as well. All right, so this is into the general section. Following that, we will have section 2. I'm going to just skip over this part, because that's not primarily what we're going to talk about today. Section 2, limitations. So those would include things like airspeed limitations, weight limitations. We'll say never exceed speed, 160 knots. What's the maximum structural cruising speed? All those limiting speeds that we've talked about before will be in this section. Following that section, we will have our emergency section. So we'll have our emergency procedures. What do you do if your engine fails? Well, if it fails during your takeoff roll, this one's going to be really insightful. They do have things like your emergency failure speeds. So I have an engine failure after takeoff, 70 knots or 65 knots if I have my flaps down, which I don't know why I would have that. Maximum glide speed, 68 knots. So engine failure during takeoff roll. Here you go. Throttle idle. Brakes apply. Wow, I would not have known that. Wing flaps retract. Mixture idle cutoff. Engine just failed, but sure. Ignition switch off. Master switch off. Right after takeoff, 70 knots. Flaps are up. Mixture idle cutoff. Fuel valve shut off valve off. Ignition switch off. Wing flaps as required. Master switch off. Cabin door unlatched. Land straight ahead. So I'm not going to go through all the emergency procedures. I just wanted to let you know that's what's in section 3. And then we have section 4. Section 4 is going to be normal procedures. How do I do a pre-flight? What do I do before I start the engine? How do I start the engine? Both with the battery or external power, normal takeoff, short field takeoff. By the way, here's an interesting little tidbit. If you look at a newer aircraft, it will not give you procedures for grass operations. That way, if you crash, then you're like, we never said it would land on grass. It's not our problem. All right, and they'll have like kind of a checklist, and they have amplified procedures. And then finally, we should get to section 5. Here we go. Performance. That's the subject for today. So a little introduction. They talk about these charts, how to use them. They're going to have the airplane at its max takeoff weight with maximum fuel. And, here's a sample, and field is 1,500 feet. What's the temperature? What's the wind? And what's the length of the runway? Okay, so they start with takeoff. So your first question is, will I be able to take off in the space that I have? So to answer that question, you'll find that there are 2 different ways that people will do these charts. Some people will say, calculate your density altitude and then look it up on the chart. Other people will say, all right, instead of doing that, I want you to say, here's what's going to happen at this temperature, like a standard temperature, at this altitude. And if the temperature is different, here's how much you vary the answer. So we have temperature conversion chart, stall speeds, What's the stall speed at different bank angles? With the flaps up, 48 knots indicated. Flaps at 30, 40 knots indicated. If I bank 60 degrees, that's going to go to 68 knots and 57 knots. So it's going to go up quite a bit. They have a little chart for calculating crosswind components. And then we have our takeoff distance. So this is the start of our flight. Will we make it? So you'll notice it says the pressure altitude is sea level. And it's 0 Celsius outside. What's my ground roll? And what's my distance to clear a 50-foot obstacle? Now, biggest thing you should keep in mind when looking at these charts. This is a new airplane flown by a decent pilot. It's actually being flown by a test pilot, but the numbers assume an average pilot. But a new aircraft. So at 0 Celsius, I should be able to be off the ground at 860 feet, clearing a 50-foot obstacle in 1465 feet. So you're like, that doesn't sound bad at all. Now, what if the temperature is a little higher? What if the temperature is really hot, 40 degrees Celsius? Now, if I'm still at sea level, my ground roll goes to 1150, and to clear a 50-foot obstacle is 1945. When do I have to start worrying? Well, I have to start worrying if I get, depending on my comfort level, most people would say within 30% of not being able to make it. That's probably something you shouldn't try. So if I was still nice and cold, 0 Celsius, but at 8,000 feet pressure altitude, I went from 860 to 1820 for my ground roll, and from 1465 to 3265 to clear a 50-foot obstacle. So is there any situation in this chart where you couldn't get out of, say, Bloomsburg, even if it was at 8,000 feet? I would say no. I mean, you might not clear the trees at the end, but, you get off the runway at least. Okay, and it says, short field technique. Prior to takeoff from fields above 3,000 feet elevation, the mixture should be lean to give maximum RPM and a full throttle static run-up. And I think that this little note is the source of much confusion, because a lot of pilots will say crazy stuff like, never lean below 3,000 feet. I'm like, where did you get that? If you're in cruise, you should lean. Always. Well, no, I learned this. Where did you learn it? They don't know where they learned it. Some of them will say, my flight instructor told me that. Well, maybe your flight instructor was an idiot. I don't know. This is just telling you to lean above 3,000 feet if you're going to take off. Because normally on the takeoff, we're sloppy rich, and that gives us extra cooling for the engine. But if you're above 3,000 feet pressure altitude, you need to lean because you need the extra power. You are not going to develop full power if you have it full rich in that situation. It says decrease distances 10% for each 9 knots of headwind. For operation with tailwinds up to 10 knots, increase distances by 10% for each 2 knots. So if you had a 10 knot tailwind First question, why are you taking off with that? Well, there better be a huge honking hill. That's all I can say. You need to increase by 10% for each 2 knots. So a 10 knot wind, that's 50% increase. For operations on dry grass runway, increase distances by 15% of the ground roll figure. Right. So yeah, they kind of have this in here. This is kind of a carryover. But again, you will not see a soft field technique in this manual. Yet, you have to demonstrate one to get your license. Okay, so that's a short field takeoff at 25, 50 pounds. And here's a little bit lighter. I'm always going to use the numbers for when it's heaviest. Right, I'm going to use the worst case numbers. And here, again, they're telling you flaps are at 10. How's it's going to work? A lower weight. Okay, so what about that? You took off. What's the next thing you want to do? You want to climb. How fast can you climb? Well, it depends on the weather. If you're at 0 again on sea level, now this is the 180 horsepower 172. So some of you might go, yeah, sure, I'm going to get that out of, let's say, a 172A, like the club's trainer. It's got 145 horsepower. Yeah, good luck. You're not going to get anywhere close to this. So at sea level, 0 Celsius, 785 feet per minute. But if I'm up at 8,000 feet, it's down to 405 at the same temperature. And let's say I'm at 8,000 feet and it's super hot, 285. That's my maximum rate of climb. So I took off, I made that, I climbed. What do I do next? Now I want to cruise. So, well, first I want to climb still. Time, fuel, and distance to climb. So if I'm starting from sea level and I'm going to 5,000 feet, it will take me 8 minutes and 1.9 gallons of fuel and 10 miles. If I'm climbing at 73 knots indicated, and my rate of climb will be about 550 feet per minute. At least at 5,000 feet. That's where I'm going to end up. And it says, add 1.4 gallons for engine start, taxiing, takeoff. Mixture lean above 3,000 feet for maximum RPM. Increase time, fuel, and distances by 10% for each 10 degrees Celsius above standard temperature. Distances shown are based on 0 wind. All right, now I climbed. Now I want to cruise. How fast do you want to go? That's a good question. Is it a rental? You going to fly it like you stole it? Or is it your airplane? Now, if you ask Cessna, you'll say, hey, what's the maximum cruise speed? What's the cruise speed for this Cessna? And they're going to give you some crazy, stupid number like 122 knots. Yeah, that sucker's going to cruise at 122. Oh, really? Now, look at the conditions. This is the 180 horsepower version. 160 is going to be even worse. In order to go a 122 knots cruise, I'm going to have to fly at 6,000 feet with 2650 RPMs. That is 83% power. And I'm going to burn 11.1 gallons per hour. That's a pretty horrid fuel burn. And that's if I'm below standard temperature. Right? If I'm at standard temperature or above standard temperature, then it's going to be a little bit different. Okay, so basically, how do you figure out this cruise chart? It's, what altitude am I going to be at? And how fast do I want to do? Now, if I am flying along and I have a tailwind, then normally I'll throttle it back. And why is that? Well, I'm getting free airspeed, so I don't need to fly this thing at 83% power. That is like absolutely insane. And I have the tailwind for less time than I'm going to have the headwind on my return flight, assuming this is a round trip. So when you have a tailwind, dial it back. If you have a headwind, then you want to put the power to it a little bit more. If it's a strong headwind. What altitudes do I want to fly at? Generally speaking, for a aircraft that is not turbocharged, kind of that 6,000 to 8,000 feet is where you want to live. That's where the air has gotten a little thinner, so the drag is down, but it's not gotten so thin that your engine is going and gasping for air. So they tend to be most efficient there. So you'll notice, 83% power, 122 knot cruise. And here at 8,000 feet, I can get 125 knots. And if I go up further, it's going to start dropping off. And this would be even more dramatic if I was looking at a 160 horsepower Cessna or 145 horsepower Cessna. Okay, so by the way, typically most people are cruising at 55 to 75% power. So 83% power is kind of insane. It's also the case that if you are cruising at that high power setting, you need to know what is the max continuous power that's permitted on that engine. You cannot run an engine at 100% power continuously. The engine manufacturer will provide you with a figure, and often that figure will also be in the manuals for the aircraft where that engine is installed. It says this is the max continuous power. And honestly, I don't know too many of them that say, oh yeah, 83% power, that's good. 75% power is a little bit nicer to your engine. Now, here's the other thing to notice. Let's just pick 6,000 feet here. So 83% power, I'm going to go 122 knots. I'm going to burn 11.1 gallons per hour. If I dial it back to 70% power, that's going to drop. It's going to drop to 115 knots and 9.6. That's a substantial drop. And if I go to 62% power, okay, now I'm down to like 109 knots and 8.6. If I really am not in a hurry, I can go 54% power, 103 knots, 7.8. Got the wind pushing me, why not? Save a little gas. Okay, so I'm in cruise. Guess what after cruise? What's next? Well, I might ask questions like, how far can I go? What's my range with 45 minutes of reserve and full tanks? It's going to tell me. What's my endurance? Maybe I'm just trying to stay aloft for a long time. and eventually I have to land. So what are my landing distances going to be? And again, it's going to tell me the techniques. It's going to say 30 degrees of flaps, power is off, maximum braking, paved, level, dry runway, 0 wind, speed at 50 feet, 61 knots. If I'm landing at sea level at 0 Celsius, my ground roll is 545. And to clear a 50-foot obstacle is about 1,300 feet. On the other end of things, 840 feet for a ground roll, 1755 to clear the 50-foot obstacle. So what's another lesson here? You can get into more places than you can get out. You might be able to get into an airport, and given the current weather, you can't get back out. So what are you going to do? Well, make the plane lighter and wait till it's cooler. Maybe wait till you have a headwind. It'll help you out as well. In the notes, it says short field technique. Decrease distances 10% for each 9 knots headwind. And again, tailwinds up to 10 knots. You're going to increase 10% for each 2 knots. For operation on grass, increase distances by 45% of the ground roll figure. Landing with flaps up, increase the approach speed by 9 knots and allow for 35% longer distances. By the way, general rule of thumb that I usually use, if you're landing without the flaps, add 10. They're saying 9 here, so it's pretty close. Okay, so that is performance. So that's for a simple plane, just for grins. Let me real quick show you a Piper Lance. All right, so here we got a Piper Lance, and let me see if I can find that section. So once again, same sections. I want to go to section 5. Section 5 is about performance. And we're going to start with our general introduction. It's going to talk about things like, basic empty weight, fuel. I mean, this is a lot more complicated situation. You got 6 seats. You've got a lot more fuel that you can take on. You've got 2 baggage compartments, one in the front, one in the rear. You got 300 horsepower that you're playing with. So it's going to be considerably different. Okay, so once again, we're going to have our different phases of flight. So we're going to say, what's my takeoff performance going to be? So let's get to that. It's talking about power off stall speed. That's great. And here we go. 25 degrees flaps, takeoff performance. So this chart's a little different. Kind of move myself out of the way here. So they'll give you an example. Let's say example, outside air temperature 60 degrees Fahrenheit, airport pressure altitude is 1,200 feet. All right, so I go from 60 Fahrenheit, I go up, and I go to my pressure altitude of 1,200 feet. Well, I don't see a line for that. I have sea level and I have 1,200, so I kind of fake it. And I say this is approximately there. And then I come over to my reference line. And then I say, how heavy is this aircraft? And they're saying 3480. Right, so I go to my reference line and then I follow one of these lines down till I get to 3480 for my weight. And then I come across, and then I'm going to adjust for the wind. So do I have a headwind? It says I have a 10 knot headwind. All right, so I have a 10 knot headwind, so I can come down until I get to 10, and then I come over, and it's going to take me like basically 1,600 feet to take off. That's my takeoff distance over a 50-foot barrier in this aircraft. Let's do another quick one. Let's just say it's 100 degrees outside. And I'm taking off from an airport at 2,000 feet. All right, so I go up to this line. I come over. And I'm going to say I'm at full gross. So I don't get to go down this line at all. I just keep going. And there's no headwind. And so now my distance is more like 2,700 feet. And that's how you figure out your takeoff distance in an aircraft like this. So again, this is a slightly different way. Instead of having this big table, they have a chart. And essentially what they're doing is they're having you calculate your density altitude over here. They also tell you things. What's my lift up speed? What's my speed at my barrier, at my obstacle? So I'm lifting off at 53 knots and I'm climbing out at 58 knots. By the way, if you've never done this, that nose is way up there. You've got 300 horsepower and it's just like, whoa, you can't see squat. And it feels very awkward doing this. All right, what's the ground roll? And again, this is with 25 degrees of flaps. You wouldn't use this much flaps in like your little Cessna. And if it's not a 180 horsepower Cessna, you're not going to take off with any flaps because it doesn't have enough power to overcome that extra drag. Okay, so, there's charts like this. Gear up, rate of climb. Again, what's my temperature? Let's say 60. And my pressure altitude is 4,000. And I'm going to come over here. And then I'm at 3,600. So my rate of climb is going to be like 500 feet per minute. If I'm lighter, at the same conditions, my rate of climb is going to be over 1,000 feet per minute. So that was my gear up rate of climb. What if I still have the gear down? I said 60, 4,000. And I come over here, hit my 3,600 and 400 foot per minute. Right. So it doesn't really like to climb very well with the gear down. All right, fuel distance and time to climb. This is gear up, flaps up, 2,700 RPMs, full throttle, 92 knots, indicated airspeed, 3,600 pounds gross weight, and no wind. So I can use my example here. 60 degrees. Now, they're saying cruise outside air temperature is 42 Fahrenheit. So they come up 6,000 feet. Their cruise altitude. And it's going to tell me what is my fuel to climb. 3.2 gallons apparently. And what is my time? Time looks like it's about 8 minutes. And then what is my distance? It's about 14 miles. Now, why do they have these other parts? Well, they're taking and they're subtracting the departure airport, which I didn't do in my quick little calculation here, right? So they're saying, here's the departure airport, and then here's the cruise. All right, now what? Well, now I want to go fly. So I can select how much power I want. Let's say I'm going to cruise at 6,000 feet at 55% power. I can set my RPMs, and then maybe I set my RPMs at 2,400, and I set my manifold pressure at 19.3 inches. How much fuel am I going to burn? That'll be in here. And it tells me at 55% power, 14 gallons per hour. This is actually, it's a little high. Interesting. All right. And this is gear up, flaps up, make sure lean to 100%. 100 degrees rich of peak. At maximum gross. All right. So what's my true airspeed going to be? Let's say it's 42 degrees. Again, here's my outside air temperature, 8,000 feet. I come up to 8,000 feet. I come over, and I can say, all right, I'm going to be at full throttle. And I'm going to do 155 knots. What if I'm at 55% power? So I come to that line, and then I come down, and it's about 132 knots or so. So 132 knots, if we want to burn a little bit more fuel, I come on over here to the 65% power, and it looks like I'm due about 146 knots. And if I have the need for speed, I've got full throttle, that'll do 155 knots. And I can look at my range and endurance again, and then guess what? I have a descent chart even for this plane. Eventually, I need to land. They have a gliding chart. But landing performance, which is nicely, on its side, makes it a little bit harder. But again, you follow the temperature up to your pressure altitude, follow that over to your reference line, follow down the appropriate chart, and then you can find out your landing distances, which I can tell you are a lot shorter than the takeoff distances in a Piper lands. Okay, so, there's a couple examples, starting with a fairly simple airplane and something a little bit more complicated of what those performance charts are like. And again, you need to add a little bit of a fudge factor and say, how comfortable am I landing in these different conditions? Other things that are in Chapter 15, they talk about crosswind landings and calculating the crosswind component. Most airplanes have a maximum demonstrated crosswind component, and there are certain limits to how low that can be per the FAA for your plane to get certified. I want to say it's something like 0.2 times your VSO, your stall speed. is the lowest demonstrated crosswind component that's acceptable to the FAA. So if you're flying a 172, the maximum demonstrated crosswind component is a wimpy like 15 knots or so. If you're flying something else like a Piper, some of the Pipers will say 25 knots. You might fly an Alaris, and I believe that the official number for the Alaris was 25 knots, although my personal record is 47. One thing you should be aware of, some airplanes run out of control. So, too much crosswind, you just can't do it. So could I have landed a Cessna at 47 knots of crosswind on that same day? Absolutely not. It physically couldn't do it. You would run out of rudder and you would run out of aileron. You just could not land in those conditions. And that's one of the things that determines a maximum crosswind that a particular aircraft can handle. So you might say, well, why could you do so much in an Alaris? It's a little two-seater. That's true. It's a low wing, and generally speaking, the low wings do better in the crosswinds. Number two, it has a stabilator instead of an elevator, so the entire surface moves, and that gives you better authority, at least for pitch. And that aircraft has an all-moving rudder. It doesn't have this teeny tiny little tab on the back that moves. Instead, the whole freaking thing moves. So you could really yaw that thing around. The ailerons are very effective as well. So there are reasons why some aircraft have a larger demonstrated crosswind component than others. I talked to the test pilot at the factory, and he told me that they had demonstrated 35 knots to the FAA, but the FAA kind of asked them, please don't put that in the book, because they were concerned that pilots would go out and try to fly with 35 knots of crosswind all the time, which obviously you can do more than that, but they were a little bit concerned. So they were conservative, and they said only 25 knots. I've seen some airplanes that are pretty wimpy. I've seen numbers as low as 12 knots for some of those planes, and it's pushing the bare minimum of what's allowed for it to be even certified. Okay, so that is chapter 15, which is all about performance.